Okay, and welcome.
All right, we'd like to welcome everyone to this fascinating program. We have our author, Rick Geffken, I apologize. His latest book is entitled Stories of Slavery in New Jersey. And he's going to discuss the entire process of enslavement in New Jersey communities and going back as far back as the 19th century. He will show how slavery went far beyond the traditional tobacco, cotton, and sugar industries. We hope you enjoy this. It should be very fascinating.
Thank you very much, Pam. And good afternoon, folks. I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see if everyone can see that. Did that come up, Pam?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, terrific. So thanks very much, folks, for coming this afternoon. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of my book, which was published by the History Press in January. So obviously we won't go into all of it, but it's a compilation of stories about a very little known up until several years ago topic of slavery in New Jersey. And I will confess that as a New Jersey guy growing up and did my schooling throughout, including my master's degree at Montclair State, no one to my remembrance ever mentioned anything about slavery here. So 4 or 5 years ago, when I was researching some other topics and writing some other articles, I kept coming across references to slavery and met someone who I'll talk to you about later that led me to do this book. So as you can see from the title, we were the very last northern state to abolish slavery, embarrassingly enough. So we're going to go through some highlights here. I will recommend to you, if you take the book, which is in the library in Middletown, or happen to get it, I would draw your attention to 12 pages of bibliography wherein I got my sources, and there's a lot of stories that have been written in more depth than we'll certainly cover today. In any event, we're going to get going here, and I think you will all recognize this image. We've probably all seen it from, oh, I don't know, kindergarten, first grade, and it's the iconic but apocryphal painting of George Washington and the men crossing the Delaware from Pennsylvania here on the right side at a place called McConkey's Ferry. They're going over here on the left to New Jersey on Christmas Eve of 1776. They're going to go down to Trenton to confront the British. And it's an imaginary scene because it was painted, 75 years after the actual event. And what were these men doing back then at the beginning? They were, of course, fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the question I'm posing in my book and for today's story is, that's terrific, but whose life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness were they advancing? And something occurred to me in the last few years that I had never noticed in this image, this famous painting, and maybe you haven't either. But if you look right there in front of George Washington, you will notice there's a black man. And of course, the answer to the question is that the people rebelling against the British at the time tended to be, like George Washington, landed gentry, pretty rich colonial planters. Of course, the men in the ranks were not, but they were interested in the pursuit of happiness for their class of folks. But that black man there, pictured in this famous image, is actually probably based on a true person. And here's another image of George Washington outside his campaign tent, if you will. And you see in the background that man. And that man was named Billy or William Lee. And surprisingly, he was George Washington's personal slave. Kind of startling to understand that, although I think most people know that the Washington family had slaves in Mount Vernon. What's ironic about this image was, while Billy Lee probably, as he did throughout the Revolutionary War, set up the tent, cook food for George Washington, take his messages back and forth, and attend to his personal needs, in this image, George Washington is holding a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And certainly Billy Lee was not free and independent. As a matter of fact, as you see, he was purchased by George Washington before the war for about 61 colonial pounds. So what does that mean? So rough order of magnitude, around that time, you could have purchased for that amount of money 8 horses or 13 cows, or if you were a really skilled tradesman, a blacksmith, let's say, or a carpenter, it would take you the better part of 2 years to make that kind of money. And I use those analogies purposely because slaves throughout our, not just New Jersey, but colonial history, were not thought of as fully embraced human beings. They were thought of as property and, frankly, machines to make white people money. It turns out that Billy Lee stayed with George Washington, faithfully served him, didn't have much choice, frankly, throughout the Revolutionary War, and retired with him to Mount Vernon in Virginia after the war, up through and including the period where George Washington became our first president. And through all of that time, decades where they had been as intimate as you might imagine, at the end of the war, when Billy Lee had met and married a former slave that he had met, when he petitioned George Washington to bring her, hang on a second, when he had petitioned her to bring that person, Margaret Thomas, down to Mount Vernon, George Washington hesitated before he allowed that. Which is kind of startling. There's no record in Mount Vernon that she ever showed up, by the way, so it may be that she passed away before she got there. Nonetheless, slaves were always considered a step below. Down in Mount Vernon, by the way, the Washingtons had, contrary to the way this image looks, quite a number of slaves. As a matter of fact, between George and Martha, they had over 300 slaves down there. And when George Washington passed away in 1799, they had been working that plantation for many, many years. And in spite of this image of well-fed and refreshed and clothed slaves, probably that was far from, not that treated well, but the vast majority were field hands and therefore not treated very well. Here's an additional image of Martha and George. These are, by the way, his adopted children, but they were her natural grandchildren, because it turned out that Martha Washington had been married before George. Her husband had passed away, and so she brought into that marriage an additional number of what were called dower slaves. By the way, there's Billy Lee in the background of this picture again. When George died, he only saw fit to free just Billy Lee and emancipate him in his will. And 20 years later, Martha Washington, when she passed away, only freed one of her enslaved persons too. Again, these slaves that she brought into the marriage, by law, George Washington could not have freed even if he wanted to. Nonetheless, a man that spent a considerable amount of time in New Jersey during the Revolutionary Wars, was a slaveholder and considered, of course, one of the founders of our country. Martha Washington was notoriously difficult with her enslaved people. And I will give you an example of the kind of attitude that she had. Here's a very young painting of her before she was married. And that's another startling statement that she made, inferring that Black enslaved people should be grateful somehow for whatever kindness she may have showed some of them. And it's typical of an attitude, not just of the Washingtons, but slaveholders in general in the colonial period. They thought that slaves should be accustomed to their natural state of enslavement, and therefore grateful that they had a roof and a couple of meals a day. Again, the kind of attitude that slavery had, that enslavers had throughout colonial America, certainly in New Jersey as well. So another very famous person that has a lot to do with New Jersey, this man who you may not recognize from this image, but in fact, that is William Penn. And although we all know him as this benevolent Quaker who was kind to the Indians, etc., it turns out that he too was a slave master and had some connections with slavery not too far from Middletown. As you know, he came over here from England and founded Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. You may not know that he later, with a syndicate of other men, bought what was the original part of our state, East and West Jersey. So he owned, William Penn did, New Jersey for a considerable number of years as an investment. He wasn't interested in living here. They wanted to sell the property. Turns out that in Tinton Falls, which a lot of you know, was an iron mill owned by a man named Lewis Morris, who was a family friend of William Penn. And in Lewis Morris's will of 1691, he bequeathed what he called his personal servant, but it was his slave, a man named Yaff, to William Penn. And in fact, when William Penn, who had then been in England at this time, came back in 1699, he took possession of this slave who had been with Lewis Morris for about 40 years at that point, and brought Yaff back to London with him. And we have a letter in 1703 from William Penn back to his secretary in Philadelphia, saying that he was about to grant Yaff his freedom because he had been faithful to him for 4 years. So we think that Yaff was born in Africa. We know that he was in Barbados with Lewis Morris, who had sugar mills down there before he came up to Tinton Falls. So some very, very prominent early citizens and founders of our colony of New Jersey were involved in the slave trade. As I mentioned, Yaff was with Penn for 4 years. He was freed in England. We know by letter in 1703. Last year, I was all set to go over there, stay with some friends to see if I could locate what had happened to the man. I don't think he would have come back here where he had been enslaved. But of course, the pandemic got in the way of that. So maybe in the future, I'll be able to find out some things. Those are prominent people, but I want to back up a few decades to tell you where slavery actually did begin in New Jersey. And it began with these people, who you could probably recognize from the way he's dressed, were the Dutch. Dutch patroons, landowners basically, in what we now call New York, but they called New Amsterdam, were interested in agricultural lands across the Hudson River in New Jersey. And in the early part of the 17th century, they were buying slaves from the Dutch West India Company to bring over to New Jersey. To give you an idea where this Bergen Neck might have been, those of you like me from North Jersey, this is a peninsula. Here's New York now, but was then New Amsterdam. The Dutch call this the North River. We now call it the Hudson River. And this peninsula is Jersey City and Bayonne. And right here, about 3 blocks from where I went to college in St. Peter's in Jersey City, was the little township of Bergen, where these Dutch came over and began to bring in slaves to this part of New Jersey between the rivers, the Hackensack and the Passaic rivers for that matter. And that's where slavery was first introduced to our state. And you might know too that slave owners and slave traders from Europe were going down the coast of Africa, originally bringing slaves across to South America and then up into the Caribbean islands that were being taken over by European powers before they came up to the 13 original colonies here in North America. Within a few years, these 2 men took over from the Dutch, and you know them as Berkeley and Carteret. And it turns out that when the English took over from the Dutch in the latter part of the 17th century, in what is considered the founding document of New Jersey that they wrote, called the Concession and Agreement of the Lords Proprietors, in that document, they gave to white colonists 150 acres for every colonist. And for every slave white colonists brought to New Jersey, Berkeley and Carteret granted them an additional 75 acres. So in fact, and surprising to all of us, I think, slavery is baked into New Jersey's founding document as early as 1665. Now, Berkeley and Carteret are responding to this guy who is the Duke of York. He was their patron. He's the one that gave them New Jersey by grant. And it turned out that several years ahead of that, in 1660, James, Duke of York, later King James III of England, actually had founded something called the Royal African Company. That company, and you can see the seal, a couple of Africans with an elephant here, That company was founded in England precisely to go down the coast of Africa, sell trade goods in exchange for human people, slaves, to bring them into the Americas. So the colony here in New Jersey, as in most of our 13 regional colonies, were founded as investment colonies. And since they were agricultural for colonists, they needed labor. There weren't enough white indentured servants, and so slaves quickly became the go-to labor source for folks in all the colonies, but particularly in New Jersey. Here's a famous image of, believe it or not, Quakers in Barbados. You can see the slaves in the background. This man is holding tobacco, which was one of the original crops that Europeans put into Barbados and other islands down there. That was superseded by sugar, which was a very expensive commodity. And in fact, I mentioned Lewis Morris before. Lewis Morris came up in the mid-1670s to Tinton Falls with about 60 or 70 of his slaves from Barbados, including that man Yap, and established in Monmouth County slavery. So by the end of that century, we had slavery in North Jersey. By the way, what is now Hudson County was then part of Bergen County, and also down here in Monmouth County. And historically, Bergen and Monmouth County had more slaves over the course of our 200-year history with slavery than any other two counties in New Jersey. The reason Lewis Morris was at Tinton Falls, by the way, is it had a source of water power where he could run, actually his slaves could run his mills to grind corn and wheat and other products that he could sell into the New York markets. So it was very important for him to have a lot of slave labor. Those of you that have been out to Tinton Falls, there's a plaque on the Crawford House, the Historic Society property, where we think the slaves were buried right there next to Pine Creek in Tinton Falls. Now, to give you an idea how quickly this took hold, one of the first census records in 1737 in New Jersey shows the white population. We didn't even have 21 counties here yet. White population of a little less than 44,000 people. Negroes and other slaves on this record, that would be Indians, by the way, who were enslaved, totaled about 4,000. And what that represents is about 8% of the total of New Jersey's population. So slavery was growing very quickly. And this scared the white slaveholders because they were very aware that there were slave rebellions throughout the Caribbean and islands, as in also colonies like New York. In fact, 4 years later, in 1741, there was a big slave rebellion in New York City, which was brutally put down by the authorities, as it always was. Slaves were hanged and quartered and burned at the stake in some cases. So slave owners, although they liked the natural propagation of more slaves, babies, and we know how that came about, don't we? Were also very nervous about the growing slave population. And so they began to enforce increasingly brutal laws about protecting themselves and enforcing slave labor that we'll talk about.
Excuse me, Rick, we have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was Ocean County a part of Monmouth at the time, or was it separate?
Exactly right. The original Monmouth County went from about the Raritan River way down to Little Lake Harbor, and it wasn't until 1850 that Ocean County was separated. So you're correct. Thank you for that question. Ocean County was originally part of this big, what was called the Monmouth Patent, and there were slaves over time throughout our area. Now, New Jersey slavery, as I mentioned, quickly took hold. It took hold out in the west part. You know, we're in East Jersey historically. In West Jersey, it began almost immediately too in the early 18th century with a guy named William Trent, who had made a lot of money in Philadelphia trading into the Caribbean in slaves, and he had slaves. And when he made enough money, he came over here, this is the Delaware River, to the Eastern Bank, and he built that house around 1719, kind of a country estate. And of course, this area was then called Trent's Town, and it evolved to Trenton, eventually becoming our capital. And when he got over there, he bought some existing mills on the various creeks there, and used slave labor to enrich himself even more. So early on in West Jersey, slavery got its foothold as well. Enter this man, Now, this man is Lewis Morris, the nephew of Lewis Morris, who owned the Tinton Falls iron mill that I talked about. Same name, named after his uncle, as a matter of fact. And he inherited that Tinton Falls property in 1691. And it turns out that this Lewis Morris also became our first royal colonial governor in 1738. And he decided to move his seat of government from Monmouth County to Trenton. And he wrote a letter to the then owner of that house, because William Trent had passed away, saying that he wanted to rent the house with a condition. And the letter that he wrote to Governor Thomas, who owned the house in Pennsylvania, was, I'd like to rent that house for you in Trenton, but I'd like you to add a kitchen wing to lodge my servants. Now, the backstory is, in colonial days, if you could afford it, you would put a kitchen separate from your house in case of fire. But also his wife, Isabella, who was going over to Trenton with him, did not want slaves living in the main house. So she wanted an outbuilding where the slaves could work and live. Now, that house still exists, and there it is today. It's called the Trent House Museum. May have been there. It'll be opened up soon again after the pandemic. I've spoken there several times. And this kitchen that was built for the Morris family was out here somewhere in the yard. It's long since gone. However, archaeologists in the last couple of years from Monmouth University, a guy named Rich Geffken, has led a team to look for remnants of what else might have been on the property. I took this picture a few years ago. Whether or not that's the foundation to the kitchen, I don't know, to be determined. But it will be interesting if they can figure out if it was, because slaves would leave often cultural items and other artifacts behind that might tell us a lot about how they lived. Because we know historically from documentation that the Morris family brought over slaves from Tinton Falls to live on that property with them. So we'll see. Also, very famous in New Jersey, Princeton has its own sordid history of slavery. You might know the famous Stockton family, but Richard Stockton, the progenitor, bought that property out in Princeton from, again, William Penn early in the 18th century. And he enriched himself and had his family fortune built by slaves out in what later became Princeton. Here's a later map of that. Richard Stockton's son, by the way, John Stockton, is the founder, one of the founders of Princeton University. This is Nassau Street, as I'm sure a lot of you would recognize. And then this man, Richard Stockton's same named grandson, Richard Stockton, was the one who, among other things, built Morven, which is right here. I've been there, and many of you may have, which was at one point our seat of our government here in New Jersey. And slaves powered the agriculture throughout the early Stockton family's years. Now, this Richard Stockton is interesting on another few levels. One is he fought against the British in the Revolution. And he was also one of the 38 signers of the Declaration of Independence who were slave holders, ironically enough. He was captured by the British during the war, and he actually died as a prisoner of war. And then something remarkable happens to show you the kind of contradictions in slaveholding in early New Jersey. He had married a woman from a well-to-do French family, Annis Boudinot. And when he died, of course, she inherited the Morven estate and all the slaves. And she did something truly remarkable after she inherited that property, which I will now let you read. In fact, she had young children and was nursing them. And when one of her slave women died, she wet nursed that young boy who grew up to be called Marcus Marsh, and she later freed him. He spent his entire life with him. So here you have these contradictory elements where slaveholders, on the nature of what they are and do, don't treat people as human beings, and yet you have this remarkable human thing. And it was not just people of this class. Throughout our colonial history, we have instances where slaves were treated brutally on one hand, and on the other hand, treated almost as normal people on the other hand. And this, in a lot of cases, predates the Quaker abolitionist movement. So people seem to always have been conflicted, I should say, about how they treated these human beings. So over time, as you would expect, slavery not just is a phenomenon with the upper class, but it reaches down into the ranks of people like us, middle class folks, particularly these two men. And a little bit north of Middletown, you know, of course, Middlesex County, and you might even recognize the little town of Morgan. Well, on the left here, you have Charles Morgan from the family that was named from. And on the right is his brother-in-law, Jacob Van Wickle. Now, Charles Morgan was originally from that part of Middlesex County, but he wound up going down south into Louisiana and opened up a plantation near Baton Rouge. And he and his brother-in-law were very keenly aware of slavery. In fact, here's an ad that his father, James Morgan, who fought against the British in the Revolutionary War, had taken out to try to get a reward for the return of a slave he captured. So the Morgan family in particular were very aware that slaves would be a valuable source of revenue even after the Revolutionary War. The other thing that was happening in the early days of the 19th century was that the laws were changing as people became more aware of the devastation of slavery. And so Morgan and Van Wickle came up with a scheme to entrap and kidnap both free slave black people to sell them. And they're responding to a law of 1808, which was called the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in New Jersey. And the effect of that law was that slaves would have to be freed after a certain number of years. Therefore, if you were a slaveholder in 1808, after 25 or so years, you would have to free your slaves, so they're going to become worth less to you. So these two men took advantage of that. They lured over 100 people to Judge Van Wickle's house, made them by law sign some phony consent forms, and lied to them and said, we're going to ship you down to the South where there's good jobs and you could begin your lives all over again. Mind you, some of these black people were already freed. Some were women with many children. And so what they did was they loaded up these people, because they had the force of the consent laws, onto ships in South Amboy. And they sent at least that many down to Louisiana, where when they got there, they sold them into slavery. It's a notorious scheme. Some of them went to Louisiana to Morgan's own plantation called Morganza. Others were sold throughout the area. And there are relatives and descendants of those New Jersey entrapped and tricked people still living there. And I happen to know some of their relatives through a project up here in New Jersey. And here's an old newspaper record, by the way, and this has mostly been forgotten. But these men were caught with this scheme. They were indicted, but they got away with it. They suffered no penalty for kidnapping and selling these so-called free Negroes into slavery. Now, there's a project that you can look up, as a matter of fact, this Saturday, which is Juneteenth. The Lost Souls Public Memorial Project is doing a memorial ceremony up in the Brunswick area. So if you'd like, you can look up that online. By the way, many of the folks in this group have traced their DNA to some of these folks that were sold into slavery down south. As far as anyone knows, none of those folks ever made it back to New Jersey after they had been sold into slavery. Again, just an embarrassing part of our history. So I want to get very particular now about slavery in Middletown, New Jersey, where I had spent some time years ago as well. And it involves these two folks. Now here, and also on the cover of my book, is a man named Charles Reeves. Charles Reeves was born enslaved in 1820 in Middletown, New Jersey, on Newman Springs Road. In that house, now it's in Homedale, because Homedale split away from Middletown. He was enslaved to a man named David Williamson. Years later, he met and married a woman named Hannah Van Cleef, who was born after him, enslaved, and maybe, we don't have the definitive documentation yet, but it may be that she's related to Van Cleef, Elizabeth Van Cleef, who was enslaved at one point in, where you may know, the Taylor Butler House on Kings Highway in Middletown. Now, what's interesting about these two folks born into slavery was Charles Reeves may have been descended and may have someone in his family may have been enslaved by English folks based on his last name. She, of course, has a Dutch last name, and the English and the Dutch were the two primary slaveholding groups, as you know, in early New Jersey. Now, their lives were influenced greatly by this law that I mentioned to you before, the 1804 Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. That act said, among other things, that if you were a slave woman and you had a female child after July 4th of 1804, that female child had to serve 21 years as a slave to your master, and if it was a male child, for 25 years. So based on their dates, roughly in the late 1840s, around 1850, both Charles Reeves and Hannah Van Cleef would have been freed from servitude and slavery by law. And that comports very well with what we know about them. Here's their marriage certificate. They were married in 1850 at what is now Homedale, but the Homedale Baptist Church, which is still there. But again, it was part of Middletown in those years. And they raised 11 children in that house. Now, to give you a point of reference, that house was on Middletown Lincroft Road, not too far from where the old Lincroft Inn, which was just destroyed a few years ago, taken down. I must have ridden by, probably a lot of you have, that old shack that they raised their children, and 4 successive generations of people were raised in that house on Middletown Lincroft Road. It was finally taken down in 1970s. It was basically a dirt shack. Now, that house was given to them by a man named John Crawford that Charles Reeves worked for. A lot of you will recognize the Crawford name, Crawford Corners Road, and other Crawford descendants in Middletown, Lincroft, Tinton Falls area. That shack was originally on where Christian Brothers Academy is now. It was rolled across the fields and given to these folks on a lend-lease basis until about 1900, when John Crawford's son deeded it over to Hannah Van Cleef, who was then the widow of Charles Reeves. So you can imagine something that we all associated with Southern plantation life happened here in Middletown, New Jersey. They're clearly not the only example of slavery here. Now, the question is, what else was going on around that time that involves Middletown? Well, it turns out that there was a federal law in 1850 also called the Fugitive Slave Law. And that law, pushed through the Southern representatives in our Congress, was a way for runaway slaves to get captured up north and returned by law to their owners. And there were severe penalties for anyone up here, New Jersey or any northern colony or state by that point, to shelter and aid escaped slaves, including jail. So in 1850, as a result of that law, we think, Crawford, this John Crawford I mentioned, sold to 14 black men a piece of property, a 3-acre piece of property in Lincroft, called now the Cedar View Cemetery. You might know it. It was in the papers several times over the last couple of years. Matter of fact, it's right next to St. Leo's on Hurley's Lane in Lincroft, Middletown. I'm part of a board of folks that are revitalizing it. We had, you may have seen in the Two River Times, a Memorial Day ceremony there to celebrate the people, the Black Americans who were buried in that cemetery. Now, 1850 is a crucial year for the Reeves family too, because it turns out that Charles Reeves purchased over time that piece of property. It's about a 38-foot by 99-foot burial ground for his family. And like a lot of these men who bought this property from the White Crawford family, we think they did it in part to become, by law, property owners, so that if slave catchers came up north to try to capture, oh, by the way, they captured free Black people too to bring them back into slavery in the South, they at least could show them a property deed, since slaves weren't allowed to own property, to prove that they were free Black people. And today, if you go to that cemetery in the back, this is that big piece of property that the Charles Reeves family still owns. That's Charles and Hannah's grave site there with a lot of their children and relatives. They have more extant gravestones in this property at the back end of that cemetery than any other family there. By the way, the reason we had the Memorial Day ceremony there was there are at least a dozen Civil War Black, what were called U.S. colored troop veterans buried in that cemetery. So it's one of the oldest Black cemeteries in New Jersey, and it's right here in Middletown. So it's a really worthwhile project that we're involved in to try to get historic recognition for it. Now, how do I know this about the Reeves family? I know it because of this wonderful woman who I met at the end of her life. She passed away 2 summers ago, May Edwards. May Edwards lived in Middletown. She was the great-granddaughter of Charles and Hannah Reeves. She was born in that house that I showed you in Middletown Lincroft Road. She had spent her career as a surgical nurse at Riverview Hospital. She rose to become the president of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society of New Jersey, and introduced me to all of this history about, especially her family, that had come from slavery in New Jersey, and alerted me to something that I had never known growing up and going to school in New Jersey, that many Black families, in fact, do know their history back to slavery. She had studied her family history for 40 years. I always assumed that Black people, because of being sold and moved everywhere, did not know their history. But she knew her history very well and helped an awful lot of other people discover their Black history. In fact, she was instrumental in me writing this book, and I dedicated it to her. Just a wonderful person. Her husband was a businessman in Middletown. They raised 4 children who have all gone on to great success. And it's a real testament to the entire Reeves family, how far they have come from what didn't seem to be a very nice start from slavery. Now, last thing I'll mention today is something that I hope you're familiar with. Slaves were running away throughout historic enslavement in the colonies. Even as early as the Revolutionary War, when the British offered freedom to any runaway slaves who would fight for them against the rebellion that they thought would be put down in a few months. Thousands, we have records of thousands of slaves ran away, including hundreds in New Jersey, to the British side to fight for the British, including a man named Colonel Ty here in Middletown and Rumson area. But over time, by the 1830s, as more and more slaves were running away and coming up north to try to get up to Canada, what evolved was known as the Underground Railroad. And just so you know, historically in New Jersey, slaves coming from the South would kind of traverse the western side of our state along the Delaware River, get to about the mid-state, the thinnest part of New Jersey, cut across, staying at a series of safe houses where they could either to get to Staten Island, perhaps up to Jersey City, into New York, and then up the Hudson River. And as we mentioned, you could see there are still houses and museums along that part of our state commemorating people that helped. Now, there's not a lot, although a lot of people think there's not a lot of records of safe Underground Railway houses in our part of the state for a couple of reasons. One, it's not the easiest way to come from the South. It's the long way. This is the longer part of our state. This is a shorter route. Secondly, obviously, if you're sheltering escaped slaves, you're not advertising it for fear of punishment. So there's not a lot of written records. Suffice it to say that there are undoubtedly escaped slaves who came up through Monmouth County. We just don't know an awful lot about them. Many people claim that they have a root cellar where people hid. it's always difficult to document that, although it probably did happen. Now, you probably know the story of the most famous Underground Railroad conductor associated with New Jersey. This woman, completely, incredibly brave woman, although her real name, you may be surprised to learn, was Araminta Minty Ross. Of course, we know her as Harriet Tubman. She later in her life, after she escaped slavery, took her mother's first name and had married a man named Tubman. But she was actually born in Maryland on the Eastern Shore, escaped, got to Philadelphia, where she joined up with a man named William Still, who was conducting the Underground Railroad out of the city of Brotherly Love. He was also African American. And she begins her escapades going back south to free her ex-husband, who had remarried because he thought she was dead. She freed her parents and then made numerous trips back during the Civil War, including spying on some Civil War Confederate camps, bringing other slaves to freedom. We know that she led at least 20 freedom excursions, probably freed upwards of 70 or 80 escaped slaves up through New Jersey and north. She, by the way, worked apparently at one point in Cape May as a hotel maid or something. After the Civil War, Harriet Tubman married again, retired to Auburn, New York, and where she could have rested. In fact, she did not. She became very involved in opening up an old age home, if you will, for escaped slaves. She was part of the nascent right for women to vote in this country, petitioned the government for a pension for her Civil War activities, and eventually got one. And she died very early in the 20th century, an incredible woman, as you know, by all accounts. And I think if we're lucky, something will happen soon that was long overdue. And because there's been a lot of talk over the last several years of honoring her, it seems to me in a very, very minimal way, but something that would be nice to put her on perhaps a $20 bill eventually. So we hope the Treasury Department these days might do that. Whoops, we lost it again, but here we are.
Rick, we do have one question about the Underground Railroad. So
Yes.
how did slaves know the way, and did they travel?
Well, that's a great question.
Okay. Thank
you. That's a good question. Several ways. There was Underground Railroad. There were safe houses run by mostly white people, but sometimes free blacks up here. Often when slaves would get recaptured, of course, they would bring back stories. And if you could get to a safe house anywhere, you would get instructions to how to get to the next safe house, or these so-called conductors would help you literally transporting you in wagons under disguise or under, let's say, hay or other crops. So there was an active neighborhood of folks helping. People in Philadelphia particularly were very active in creating routes for these slaves. So as you would expect, there's a lot of ways for people to get information. And it didn't always work. People were recaptured all the time. But there's a fascinating story about the Underground Railroad written by William Still, who is considered the founder of it. So I'd urge you to look that up. I'll bet it's in the library as well. Finishing up here, how did New Jersey finally approach abolition of slavery? And the answer, as you can see, is we approached it as a state agonizingly slowly. It took us a long time to come to grips with this evil. As I mentioned early on, we began to regulate slaves very, very tightly. As early as 1714, New Jersey passed an act that said slaves found without a permission slip any more than 5 miles from their master's home could be whipped by anybody in return for reward. Also, it said that if you decided out of the goodness of your heart to free your slaves, you'd have to provide the equivalent of $38,000 today to free that person, and another $3,800 every year that that person lived. That was put into that law specifically to discourage people from freeing their slaves. You know about this law already that said slave children were still bound for almost a quarter of a century, probably a third of their lives at that point, as slaves until they were eventually manumitted. Our 1844 early Constitution said that all men were free and independent, which looks really good, but that clause was taken to court, and our Supreme Court ruled a year later that they didn't mean that. What they really meant was only white men. They didn't mean black people, they didn't mean slaves, and they certainly did not mean women in our early Constitution. Nonetheless, we do see slavery as an institution in Jersey kind of going down to a smaller and smaller number, probably because of this act in 1846. Now, what it did, as great as it sounds, was it said that current slaves still had to be apprentices for life. So even though on paper we're showing a decreasing number of slaves from that point forward in the census records every 10 years, it's really a disguise because some people still owned black people, but they were listed as apprentices and not slaves. Suffice it to say that by 1860, there's less than 24 slaves left on paper in New Jersey, although there were certainly dozens, if not hundreds more. Now, what finally happens, of course, I think you know, that you might not know this, however, that New Jersey was also the only northern state that voted twice against Abraham Lincoln in both of his electoral runs, the first time and then his reelection. Now, because of his initial election, the South Carolina in this case, seceded very quickly because Lincoln was known to be thinking about abolishing slavery. The Civil War begins, and we go through that terrible period in our country. Civil War fought, of course, over slavery. When Lincoln issues the famous Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, recall please that he only frees the slaves in the states of rebellion. He did not have the power then, under law, of freeing the slaves up in the North because they were considered private property and the federal government could not do anything about that. Juneteenth, by the way, which is celebrated this Saturday, is the day when, in the Civil War, the proclamation finally was announced in Texas. That's become an unofficial holiday, as you know, for Black people everywhere. There are several celebrations about that, including one at the T. Thomas Fortune House this Saturday in Red Bank. In 1865, after the war, Lincoln's assassinated in April that year, and by December of that year, the requisite number of 27 of the then existing states ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So it's a done deal by December of that year, except that our state decided to wait because there were still people that didn't believe in it in New Jersey, and our legislature went along finally in January of 1866 with the last of the northern states to decide officially to abolish slavery. It took us another 150 years before our legislature issues an apology for the wrong, as you see, inflicted upon folks by slavery. As good as that is, there's something missing from that I think we're going to see a lot of very soon. And that is, there was nothing that our legislature has done to date about reparations for all of that. Now, you should know that there are independent institutions like the Princeton Theological Seminary, for instance, that a few years ago decided to give descendants of some of their enslaved people scholarships. Georgetown in Washington, D.C. University has done that as well. I think you're going to see a lot of talk, and in my view, correct talk about reparations to the descendants of people that were denied part of the American dream by redlining and a lot of other practices that we've engaged in since slavery was abolished. So we'll keep an eye on that and see what happens. It's my contention in this book, by the way, that unless we understand the history of this, we won't be able to go forward and do the things as a country and certainly as a state that we have to do in order to right some of this historic wrong. Last thing I'll say before we open up for questions is that I'm part of a project that is now retitled. It was originally called the New York Slavery Records Index, wherein we're collecting database information, putting it out at this website on any slavery records, slaveholders, slave ships, slave sales, slave manumissions, in the hope that people can look up their genealogy, their history, whatever it might be. It's now expanded throughout the Northeast, since slavery was in every one of the original 13 colonies and all of the states up north at one point or another. So if you know of any records or data, I would ask you to get a hold of me. I'll give you my email in a second. We'll be glad to include it into this database, which is free, and you can look it up online. It's a great source of information. It's being sponsored, by the way, by Monmouth University down here in West Long Branch. So I'll open up to questions now. There's cover the book again. If you would like to get assigned a dedicated copy of the book, I'd be glad to do that. You could just shoot me an email, rickg0817@yahoo, and I'll let you know how to do that. But in the meantime, thank you, and I'll open up to any questions we might have.
Rick, we have one question from the chat. Did Civil War officers take slaves with them, and did they fight?
Wow, that's a great question. I assume the question is Yankee Civil War officers, but the answer is, perhaps I misinterpreted, maybe it's Confederate. There were Confederate officers that absolutely took some of their slaves with them. There were Yankee officers who took, we hope, freed black men with them as servants. The records are, more and more records are coming to light. I will say this, there is no, and I use the words advisedly, black and white to any of this stuff. For instance, you might be embarrassed and surprised to hear that Lenape Indians, the Indian Native Americans who were here in New Jersey, owned slaves. They owned both black and other captured Indian slaves. There were freed slaves that owned slaves. So it's a broad mix of folks. So when it comes to the Civil War, certainly men in the South who were defending that practice, if they could, would bring their slaves. Black troops, U.S. colored troops, as you already know, were fighting against that. But it's a broad mix, and you'd have to look at the individual records that are coming out all the time. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of Henry Louis Gates' PBS series. Remarkable documentation is coming. Again, this book is a compilation of lots of things that are in my bibliography, where you'll get more in-depth treatment of what black scholars and white scholars in New Jersey have been writing about for a long time. So I would urge you to look into that. Great question. Anyone else have any comments or questions?